There is a tale told in certain villages deep in the mire. A story passed from samurai to samurai, from peasant to peasant, and from daimyo to daimyo. Many knew the story. None were sure of the truth, but all knew to fear and respect the spirits of the mire. In a time long past, when the mother of yokai, the great Jorogumo, had broken free of her prison, she was soundly defeated by the demon dagger wielded by Maiko, the yokai slayer. She then sealed herself within the Tree of Souls for all eternity, so that the yokai spirits would never again break free to terrorize the world. However, not all yokai were slain. Not all were accounted for. Not all were even found. Some still lurked in the darker places of the mire. Some found homes in abandoned villages, or in the souls of villagers and samurai hungry for power, for wealth, or for pleasure. Some even wandered beyond the realms of the mire to corrupt and attack Valkenheim and Ashfeld. Though sparse and just rare enough to be considered abnormal, these fiends and yokai made themselves known and feared throughout Heathmoor. But there were some spirits who were not so malicious. Some were not Aratama, but Nikitama, peaceful, benevolent, kind. It is a well-known belief to the samurai and the Wulin that the gods and spirits of this world are not to be trifled with, not to be angered. Honoring the kami will bring honor to you and your household. So there were those who guarded the shrines to these spirits, those who went to these shrines to show respect to the guardian deities and spirits of the mire. In a small town known as Shichimachi, there is a great tree. A tree that's mighty limbs seem to reach out and cover the entire village. Like a great canopy or roof, the village has built itself around this tree, gathering to it and using its leaves, bark, and fallen timber to build their homes under its shade. Their boats and their lives and their houses all relied on this tree, this mighty, blessed tree. It was believed to be the home of a spirit, a powerful one, a great guardian Nikitama. Whenever the village was called upon to bring forth samurai for the war efforts, the samurai would go to this tree and grant offerings to it, for safety and for strength. Every villager knew that to honor this tree was the duty of the villagers, to honor the kami that dwelled within, this ancient relict of the time of yokai. There came a day when the samurai were called for a great battle. While Horkos was distracted dealing with the rising threat of the Aphira, the Vikings of Valkenheim saw an opportunity to invade the northern territories of the Mire, and thus samurai from every village were called to fortify the defenses. Thus, this village was now defenseless, save for a small handful of old warriors too injured or aged to be able to make the journey. The offerings were made to the great tree and to its kami, and then the samurai of the village were gone. But in their absence, a new enemy emerged. The yokai that still roamed the world had caused superstition and fear to run rampant, and helped fuel the fire of a rising cult, the Servants of the Stake. Mad cultists who worshipped sacred relics of Heathmoor's past, one of which being the demon dagger, which had once purged the world of yokai. Seeing yokai active had led the Servants of the Stake into the mire to seek out these horrible demons. And when the cult learned that there was a village that honored and venerated a spirit living within their sacred tree, they were filled with curiosity and zealous rage. The cult came in the night like cutthroats. They attacked with savage fury. A few Nobushi ran to the defense of the village, and at least 2 Aramusha with them, but they were outnumbered by the vicious cultists. The battle was brutal, savage, and cold. The village defenders did all they could, but even with their desperate and passionate efforts, they could not push back the cult before almost half of their village was burned and a third of the town was slaughtered. Pools of blood flowing across the moist ground like rivers, converging before the tree they loved so much. Bodies lay in the street, strewn across fences, butchered like cattle. Men, women, and children, even infants were not spared the zealous fury of the cult. And when they were finally repelled, only 3 Nobushi and 1 Aramusha remained standing. and the surviving villagers, who all mourned their losses, their tears mixing with blood upon this defiled ground. But the cult was not done. All the villagers knew that. Their numbers were still great, their zealotry still mighty. They would return, and when they did, the village would be lost. In their desperation, they sent word to the neighboring daimyo for aid, but in the meanwhile, they did the only thing they could do. They turned to their spirit. All the villagers, one by one, offered all that they had left for salvation. Old man Yoshi, the blacksmith, offered his only remaining hammer, a simple mallet really, but it was all he could pull from the fire that had once been his forge. Madame Taume, the wife of the local carpenter, who died in the battle, gave his saw, which was still covered in the blood of her husband, who had tried to use it to defend her the night before. A small boy named Riku offered his play club, a small shaft of wood weighted on one end. His dream was to be an Orochi like his father, and he had played with this club as if it could one day be the sword he longed to carry. But now he had lost part of his hand. He could never again grip a weapon. Ryota, the only living Aramusha, offered one of his swords, a simple short blade, and prayed that he could still fight using his other one. Koji and Sakura, a married couple that lived on the outskirts of town, approached the tree in tears, wailing in lamentation, laying the body of their only son at the foot of the tree, as well as Koji's scythe, which he'd used all his life to work the fields as a cultivator. But it meant nothing now without his son, to whom he would have passed it on to. A sasumata, a simple fighting fork with one of its prongs broken off, was brought as well by a small stable hand who had used it to try and defend the stables with the horses within. He'd failed, and he'd lost his left arm in the process. It was useless to him now, as he was useless without his arm. The smell of singed, burning corpses of horses still filled his nose, but if the spirit within the tree would accept this small token, perhaps it could be useful once more, even though he was not. And last, one of the Nobushi, a young, inexperienced girl named Sayuri, brought forward her weapon, a kamayari. It had once belonged to her mother, and her grandmother before that, and her great-grandmother before that. That great-grandmother had claimed that she had fought beside Maiko herself in the ancient battle against the Jorogumo. But Sayuri, tears running down her face, laid down this weapon before the tree, along with every other offering, every item, every blood-stained body. The village wailed. They wept, and the sky rained down in somber answer to their grief. But tears would not defend their home from the cult when they returned. Every villager knew that when the dawn came, they would die. Tears, rainwater, and blood rolled like a river to the roots of the sacred tree. The servants of the stake numbered 50 men and women, all hungry to finish what they'd started before. They would burn down the wretched village and set fire to that monstrous tree in its center. They had heard the cries of the villagers in the night. They had seen the fires that had all but gone out due to the rain, and they had rejoiced. Their work was almost done here. One more attack was all they needed. As dawn broke and the humid mists filled the air, the cult marched through the fog like ravenous wolves. But as they approached the village, they saw not the few remaining Nobushi standing watch for them. They saw not pleading villagers on bended knee begging for their lives. They saw something in the fog. It stood like a statue at the gate, shaded from the rising sun by the great tree behind it, whose leaves were stained crimson. He walked atop a river of bright red, and his clothes were an emerald green like the very trees and leaves around them. His face was hidden by a frightening mask of a demon, and yet it seemed so unlike a mask. Though it made no expression besides its cold and furious glare, there was something about it that seemed almost alive. It did not move. It did not seem to even breathe as it glared down the coming cult. Clutched in its right hand was a great kamayari. Strapped to its back, a mallet. a scythe, a small club, and a satsuma fork. On his hip was a saw, and an Aramusha's short blade. This beast was armed with 7 weapons, and the aura around him, rather, the very mist itself, seemed thick with a bloodlust, a vengeful anger that made even the zealotry of the cultists take pause. Though he was but one man, there was a power behind him, a strength, a warning. "Watashi o sagashitamasita ka," the being snarled. His voice radiated from his throat like rolling thunder. The very air around him thick with rage. "Watashi ga kita." The cult was terrified by this man, but they charged forward all the same. The statue moved. With a scream, the nearest cultist was struck by the Kamayari as it shot through his stomach and out his back. As another ran to attack, the demon reached for his back and grabbed the scythe on his shoulder, swinging it in an arc. He cleaved the neck from the cultist, sending the head rolling. The cries of a dying child resounded through the fog with the movement of the scythe. Haunting images of blood and death flashed in the minds of every cultist. This monster was not fighting with mere weapons, but with the blood and pain of the villagers. The pain they had inflicted, the sins they had committed, and it was now being wielded against them. A brave cultist wielding an axe charged the monster. The beast withdrew his spear from the first cultist and backhanded the axeman with his free hand. As the axeman staggered, he was suddenly struck in the throat by the Sasumata. As blood sprayed from his neck like a geyser, the wails of a weeping stable boy filled the eyes of the cultist as well as the blood. The dying cultist sank to his knees, and a fourth tried to intervene, striking at the demon's back. The demon stepped aside to let his attacker pass before bringing a mallet down upon the attacker's head with a disgusting, sickening crunch that shattered the skull like an egg. And as blood dribbled from the ears and eyes of the dead cultists, the air was filled with the vision of a blacksmith's forge set ablaze, a forge that would never again produce weapon, horseshoe, or tool. A man's dream and legacy left in ash. There was genuine fear now. 4 cultists had attacked, and 4 had died to the demon. And with each death, with each strike of the weapons, the cultists had seen the air filled with visions of pain, sin, and loss, and their souls were screaming in horror. What power was this that drew on the very soul, that filled the heart with guilt, terror, and dread? This was no ordinary man, no ordinary force. This was a demon. A beast who fought with souls in the palms of his hand. A few fled, and they were butchered. The demon moved with an otherworldly speed and struck them down before they made it to the safety of the forests. One tall cultist, who may have once been a Shugoki, swung his massive weapon at the demon. There was no stopping the weapon, no stopping its trajectory, and yet, as it came, the demon raised his hand and caught the massive hunk of wood with one outstretched palm before swinging a small club of his own at the lumbering oaf, smashing him across the teeth with not only the wood of the Tetsubo, but also with the ruined dreams of a small child who watched his world go down in fire and blood. Another warrior, a woman this time, wielding a longsword, attacked and tried to stab the demon. The demon blocked the blade with his spear and then plunged the tip of his sword into her face. And the last thing this cultist saw before the blade took her life was the vision of an Aramusha, desperately holding back hordes of her own comrades in desperation and pity and the sudden onset of abject failure, knowing that he'd failed his duty, failed to protect that he loved, and she died feeling his disgrace. One cultist, a man with a large and powerful glaive, made one desperate attack, a final move to catch the demon unawares. But like the mist itself, the demon seemed to just flip out of his reach, and with his dodge, the demon pulled a bloody saw. The glaive-wielding cultist recognized that saw. He'd seen it in the hands of a middle-aged man trying to wave it in defense of his wife. How he'd laughed as he knocked the man down and butchered him with that very saw. And as that saw now bit into his own throat and drew his life from him, he felt it, the pain in that man's heart, the love for his wife and the biting, gnashing fangs of death, digging, clawing, and dragging everything from his neck. Every blow was a bite of the soul, Every strike was a scream of the oppressed. Every delivered death was an answer to the wails of the village. These were not ordinary weapons, but devotions, gifts, offerings to a furious kami. As cultists fell, blood rained and the mist consumed it, until only one warrior remained. Once he may have been a lawbringer. Once he may have been a figure who stood for justice and order. Now he was a savage killer, a zealous, mindless brute. But he did not flee. He knew that no matter how strong this demon was, his weapons could not pierce his armor or his spirit. He would finish this brutish sentinel for his pride, for his cause, and for the sacred artifacts he worshipped. For the servants of the stake he charged, raised his halberd, and this time he did not miss. The axe dug into the demon's shoulder. With a triumphant snarl, the corrupted lawbringer howled his victory. But the demon did not move. He did not shift, did not step back. Suddenly, the demon's hand shot forward and grabbed the lawbringer's helm with mighty fingers that knew no weakness. He gripped with such force the metal of his mask was creaking. The lawbringer released his own weapon to try to break the hold of his attacker, but with no success. The demon raised his spear, and the lawbringer saw it, felt it, heard it. His sins lay before him like a tapestry painted into the very weapon that would be his demise. He could practically see the animosity and pain of the weapon flowing into the spear. And then the demon struck. Meil no Shida! His bellowed this as his spear struck, impaling through the armor, the flesh of the chest and back, and then breaking through the very back of the armor itself. And as blood burst out of the lawbringer's mouth, through his helm, splattering the fingers of his killer, he saw it. A woman wielding this very weapon against a true monstrous demon alongside Maiko. An elderly Nobushi fighting beside her own daimyo against invaders from Ashfeld. Another Nobushi carrying this weapon against the Vikings of Valkenheim. And then a young, inexperienced girl, weakly wielding this weapon to fight him, to repel him, and only surviving because he'd thought her body too appealing to destroy. Rather, he'd save her for later for his own pleasure. And that fear coursed through him now. That fear of being killed, being abused, being toyed with, being lost forever. He felt the fear of that girl, the rage of those women who had known this weapon, and the terror of death. When Richard Blackthorne received the call for aid, he arrived 3 days after the attack had taken place. When he and his men arrived, he saw the figure standing guard still at the gate, waiting, glaring, his gaze that of death and fury. Richard stepped down from his horse and approached the tall sentinel, but said nothing. The demon glared at him and also said nothing. It was as if the two were taking each other's merit. Richard then bowed his head respectfully. I come to aid this village. May I pass? There was no answer at first from the sentinel. A long and dangerous pause seemed to last between the two. Richard tightened his grip on his weapon, prepared for any possible response. Domo, the sentinel finally said with a bow of his head, and then, without another word, turned and walked away, vanishing into the mist. Richard watched the mist where he'd vanished for a long moment, before finally leading his samurai in. There, to their shock and horror, they found this village restored, rebuilt, reforged. Lives could not be returned, but to rebuild a building, to restore a lost home, these things could be done. Surviving villagers ran to greet the samurai and Richard, and to him they told of the sentinel stranger. The legend was spread, the story of a mighty warrior who appeared as if from the great tree itself. A warrior who wielded souls like weapons, who tore through his foes like a demon and knew no fear. The villagers gave a name to the sentinel demon, a fitting name, for he walked above the river of despair and blood they had created, and as a sudden and destructive force, not unlike the very wind itself. This spirit had a name now. Kawakami Hayate.